Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to Quinn by Iris Johansen. Chapter 13. She's caught up with Gallo. Eve turned to Jane as she hung up the phone. I know it. Jane frowned. But she didn't tell you that? Eve shook her head. Not exactly. She was thinking over exactly what Catherine had said. It was all very vague and ambiguous. I was uneasy for the moment I picked up the call. If she's found him, why wouldn't she tell you? How the hell do I know? She grimaced. Or maybe I do know. Gallo is unusual. He managed to convince me that black was white in two separate periods of my life. I warned Catherine that he was capable of dazzling anyone, she added with frustration. But she's tough as nails. I was hoping that she'd be immune to him. Maybe she is, Jane said. You're only guessing, Eve. She was questioning me about... She's been talking to him, Jane. About what? Jane asked. She asked if I'd... She moistened her lips. She said she wondered if I'd thought that Bonnie visited me after her death. In her wildest dreams, she wouldn't have asked that question if she hadn't talked to Gallo. Why would she? There's no more grounded or realistic person. There's no more grounded or realistic person on earth than Catherine. Except me, Jane made a face. And I've made giant strides in accepting the unacceptable. But then I've had a long time to come to terms with Bonnie. And you still don't feel comfortable with the idea, Eve said. Well, neither does Catherine. I could tell that she's upset as hell and trying to fight her way through it. But Gallo has her going around in circles. What has Gallo got to do with her asking about Bonnie? Eve was silent, and then said finally, He's seen Bonnie. He's seen Bonnie too. At least he told me he had. Oh, shit. Jane gazed at her in shock. And you believed him? I believed him, she said jerkily. I believed everything he told me. He said she came to him in that cell in Korea when she was still alive, and that she visited him after her death. I fell for everything he told me. That's why I went with him to hunt down Paul Black when Gallo told me that he'd killed Bonnie. Why? How could you believe him? Because I was a fool. It all had to be lies. Why would Bonnie come to him if he'd been the one who killed her? She shook her head. And now he has Catherine believing his lies. And that put Catherine in greater danger than Eve had dreamed. An enemy within the gates could be deadly. It has to stop. She turned toward the elevator. I can't let it go on. Where are you going? Jane hurried to keep up with her. As if I couldn't guess. Look, you can't go after Catherine. You don't know what kind of situation you'd uncover up there in the woods. Particularly if you think she's been bamboozled by Gallo. You think Catherine would hurt me? Eve shook her head. Don't be ridiculous. You don't know her, Jane. No, I don't. But you said that she wasn't behaving normally. So how well do you know her, Eve? Very well. Eve punched the elevator button. I just have to see her face to face so that I can set her straight. I need you to do me a favor. Joe won't like this when he hears about it. Stall him as long as you can. Stall him? He'll be out of this hospital and on your trail the minute he hears that you're not here. He's already had his night sedative. All you have to worry about is when he wakes tomorrow. Find a way to keep him here. One day, Jane. That should be all I need to find Catherine and talk to her. That sounds simple, but it would be hard as hell. I'd have to lie. I've never lied to Joe. Jane's lips thinned. And I won't let you go up there alone. You may trust Catherine Ling, but I don't. And leave Joe here in the hospital without either one of us? Joe is the reason you came here, Jane. When you first arrived, you asked me what you could do to help me. Well, now I'm telling you, damn it. Joe is due to be released in the next couple of months, in the next couple of days, and I was trying to think of a way to delay him after going Gallo. And I was trying to think of a way to delay him going after Gallo. The thing with Catherine is going to blow away any chance of that. You bet it is. Then give me at least a day to get up there and contact Catherine. I'll try to get her back on track. Jane shook her head. Don't you refuse me. Eve's voice was shaking. You give me that day. I almost lost Joe. I can't prevent him from going after Gallo, but I can keep Catherine on the job to help him. That's not all you're doing, Jane said bluntly. You're going to go after Gallo yourself. Eve should have known that Jane would guess her intentions. They were too close not to be able to read each other. Joe said Bonnie told him that we're reaching the end, she said unevenly. If that's true, then I should be the one to reach it first. She reached out and grasped Jane's arm. I'm not afraid of Catherine, and I'm not afraid of Gallo. Give me my day, Jane. Damn you! Jane's eyes were glittering with moisture. She reached out and hugged Eve close. One day, Eve. After that, Joe and I will both be on your trail. Eve brushed Jane's cheek with her lips and let her go. Thanks, Jane. This means a lot to me. I know. Do you think that if I didn't realize you were on the edge, I'd have given in? It's nearly killing me to let you go. Jane watched her get into the elevator. I hope Bonnie is right. I hope this nightmare is coming to an end. So do I, Eve said, as the elevator door closed, shutting her away from Jane. The search for Bonnie had been a nightmare for Jane also. She knew. Jane's strength and courage had caused her to downplay any pain or loneliness that might have resulted from Eve's obsession with finding Bonnie. But those emotions had been there, and Eve had been aware of them. It's been too long for all of us, Bonnie. Let me bring you home. Are you awake? Catherine opened her eyes to see Gallo sitting by the fire a few yards away from her. I am now, she said dryly. Since it's obvious you want me to be. He smiled. Yes, I do. I was lonely. I held off for a little while, but then I yielded to temptation. I knew I wasn't going to sleep, and I wanted company. I never said I wasn't selfish. He crossed his legs Indian style. Or that I wasn't curious. About an hour and a half ago, you tucked yourself into that sleeping bag immediately after you talked to Eve. It had all the signs of an escape move. But I judge that you're not one to hide your head under a blanket. I wasn't trying to escape you. If I had, I would have taken off when you gave me the chance. I had some thinking to do. And I did it. She stared him in the eye. And I decided you were the most outrageously idiotic individual on the face of the earth. And Eve wasn't far behind you. His smile faded. Indeed? I assume you're referring to what I told you about Bonnie. I told you that I didn't expect you to believe me. I don't know whether I believe you or not. It would take a hell of a lot more than a tale about a red-haired ghost child skipping merrily through your life to make me give up reality for that kind of fantasy. Her lips tightened. But it's clear you and Eve have bought into it and won't be argued out of your Bonnie visions. Eve told you? Hell no. She danced around it very warily, but it was clear she wasn't talking about the same bond that you were. She sees Bonnie. And that makes us both idiots. I told you that wasn't what I was talking about. You're both idiots because you believe Paul Black. You're both idiots because you believed Paul Black when he told you that he knew that you had killed your daughter. He was telling the truth. You and Eve kept saying that, but I trust and admire Eve's judgment. I went along with her when she said she was certain. As for you, why should I doubt anything bad about you when you were the enemy? No reason at all, except your blind relief in what Black said has been bothering me lately. It didn't seem right, and the more I thought about it, the more ridiculous it became to me. She shook her head. I'm no psychiatrist, but I don't think anyone is capable of murdering a child they love unless they're totally mad. You may have had bouts of instability, but you're not crazy, Gallo. How do you know? Because I know you just as you know me. After these weeks in the woods, I know you very well. Sometimes I feel as if I can read your mind. I know your slyness, your cleverness, your recklessness, but you've never shown me any hint of cruelty or insanity, she added flatly, which means that both you and Eve have to be wrong when you accepted Black's word. She held up her hand as she opened his mouth to speak. Don't give me that bullshit. I don't care if Black believed what he was saying. So what if he wasn't lying? That doesn't mean he couldn't be wrong. She glared at him. You and Eve are both so tormented because of your love and guilt about Bonnie that you can't see straight. She's doubted you from the moment you came back into her life. Part of that was my fault. You were number one on my list as Bonnie's killer. You doubted yourself because of the blackouts you were having and the doctors who told you that you were a little bonkers. More than a little. She shrugged. Whatever. At any rate, you should have thought instead of reacted. Eve was terribly upset about Joe, so she had some excuse. But you should have known you weren't capable of killing Bonnie. His lips twisted in a one-sided smile. According to you, Catherine? She was suddenly up and kneeling before him. Damn it, yes, according to me. Her hands closed on his shoulders, and she shook him. I'm the only one with any sense around here. You were trying to throw yourself off a cliff, and Eve and Joe were going to hunt you down and kill you. Do you know how that would have made them feel when they found out Black was wrong? Guilt and more guilt, and that damn search for Bonnie would have started again. Her breasts were rising and falling with the force of her breathing. And I would have been right in the middle of all that angst. No way. I've done enough things in my life that earned me my portion of guilt without you bringing me more. Now stop it, and let's clear this up. His eyes were narrowed on her expression. You really don't think I did it, did you? You really don't think I did it, do you? At last, a breakthrough. Her hands dropped from his shoulders. How many times do I have to say it? Black was wrong. He may have believed you killed Bonnie, but that doesn't make it true. She sat back on her heels. Damn it, you'd think that you wanted it to be true. God, no. His voice was hoarse. I've been living in a nightmare. The pain in his expression was terrible to see. She wanted to reach out and touch him, comfort him. Don't do it. She was already too close to him. You deserved it. All you had to do was take the situation apart and look at the separate pieces. He started to smile, then shook his head. You know I still don't believe you. I want to, but I'm afraid that I'll find out that I was right and you were wrong. Then you wouldn't be any worse off, would you? This time the smile actually came into being. Oh, I would be worse off. It's a terrible thing to lose hope. He reached out and gently touched her cheek. But it would be worth it to have a chance to go down the road you're leading me. She could feel her skin flush beneath his fingers, and her chest tightened. No, she mustn't feel like this. It got in the way. She moved her head and his hand dropped away from her face. Nice words. Now, shouldn't we get down to business? I completely blew it with Eve tonight. I'll be lucky if she doesn't show up here and try to track me down. We need to be gone before that happens. And where are we going? If Black didn't kill Bonnie, and you didn't kill Bonnie, then we have to find out who did. Logical, he was thinking. She could almost see the wheels turning. Okay, if Black didn't kill Bonnie, and was certain that I did, it was because Quinn and Jacobs had told him I had done it. Quinn must have even paid Black to shoulder the blame, so that I would search for him all those years. Why? Eve said that she thought that Quinn was afraid that if you found out that you'd killed your daughter during one of your blackouts, you'd have a complete breakdown. He wouldn't want you to be put away in a mental institution where he couldn't control you. Doctors asked too many questions, and you knew too much about his criminal activities. She frowned, and I accepted that explanation because it all made sense. It still makes sense. His lips twisted. It's difficult to discard it and look in any other direction. Why else would Quinn go to all that trouble to make Black a decoy? Unless he killed Bonnie himself. And why would he do that? He has no reason. Black might have had revenge as a motive, but Quinn was still using me to do his dirty jobs all over the world and had no idea that I was beginning to suspect him. I don't know why, damn it. Every question had a roadblock, and her frustration level was climbing. And we can't even ask the bastard. Black killed Quinn. Back to square one, Gallo said. Then suddenly, an indefinable expression flickered over his face. Or maybe not. Jacobs. Her gaze flew to his face. Quinn's assistant. He nodded. You could call him that. Lieutenant Thomas Jacobs. He'd been joined at the hip with Quinn at Army Intelligence for years, and he was partner in Quinn's various crooked enterprises. He was with Quinn from the beginning. He was always there in the background, even in that first meeting when I was sent into North Korea. I never considered him a factor because Quinn always dominated. But he might know something. Gallo nodded. It's a possibility. Just because he was in the background doesn't mean that Quinn didn't trust him. It was a long-standing partnership. Maybe Quinn even found Jacobs more valuable because he was the invisible man. Invisible. Yes, Catherine had not considered Jacobs important when she'd been investigating Nate Quinn and trying to trace Gallo. He'd been completely overshadowed by Quinn, but now he was standing alone and might be the key. Where is he? How can we get to him? He was still in Inscom the last time I talked to Quinn weeks ago, but a lot has happened since. After Black was killed, the ledger that held proof of Quinn's and Jacob's smuggling and drug dealing must have been discovered by the local police. There's no indication in it that it had anything to do with Army intelligence, but they would have had Eve's statement about that. And the book had to be on Black's body at the time I killed him. If the sheriff followed up on it, then Jacobs has to be in big trouble. Catherine shook her head. The sheriff didn't mention any ledger to me when I was on the search for you those first few days, but then we weren't concerned about anything but finding you. Yes, I feel very important, Gallo said. I would have felt still more important if I'd known you joined them on the hunt. You are much more interesting. Don't bullshit me, she said bluntly. You didn't care a damn about whether I was after you or not. You were too busy trying to get yourself killed. And you've already remarked on that particular idiocy. It bears repeating. Why didn't you? She stopped and added with exasperation. If you had this intimate relationship with Bonnie, why didn't she just tell you that you hadn't killed her? I don't know. I was in torment. There were moments when I didn't even believe Bonnie was actually there. He shook his head. I just knew that I couldn't take my own life. then your daughter is the most unsatisfactory spirit in the universe. What good is she? She turned away, and it makes me doubt even more that she actually exists. If you and Eve weren't two of the most intelligent and grounded people I've ever met, I'd be sure of it. But you're not sure, he smiled faintly, and it's bothering the hell out of you. I'll get over it. And she'd get over the effect Gallo was having on her. She just had to block those parts of her mind and body that seemed to be acutely and exquisitely attuned to him. After I find out what happened to Bonnie, and I can put you behind me, then I'll be able to move on with no looking back. She took out her phone. Put out the fire while I call the sheriff and see what I can find out about that ledger. Then we'll get on the road and try to track down Jacobs. He nodded and began to extinguish the flames. As you command. For the time being, she thought ruefully, Gallo wasn't going to accept any will but his own for long. She absently watched him work about the camp as she talked to Sheriff Rupert. Lord, Gallo was stunning. In black jeans and shirt, he looked lean and yet muscular, and the way he moved. She jerked her attention back to what the sheriff was telling her. As she hung up, Gallo turned to face her. Well? The day after Black and Quinn were taken to the local morgue, Thomas Jacobs showed up with his Army intelligence credentials and a story about how Nate Quinn was undercover and trying to find a way to trap Black. According to him, Paul Black was supposed to be a suspect in the killing of an Army intelligence officer. But they already had a statement from Eve about Quinn's involvement with Black. Evidently, Jacobs was very plausible, and Sheriff Rupert isn't used to dealing with military and government types. He was even impressed with my credentials. It was probably not your credentials that impressed him. He's a typical good old boy, and he appreciates a beautiful woman when he sees her. You should know. Evidently, you became buddies with him and the entire sheriff's office. It seemed the thing to do at the time. So did Jacobs get his hands on the ledger? No, the sheriff wasn't that gullible, though Jacobs tried to tell him that it was evidence and was needed to save military lives. It was in Korea, so Jacobs had a good shot at convincing him of his story. It hadn't been translated. It was in Korean, so Jacobs had a good shot at convincing him of his story. It hadn't been translated. It hadn't been translated yet? No, clearly things move slowly up here, she added. And Sheriff Rupert was a little suspicious when Jacobs didn't mention claiming Quinn's body for burial. It didn't seem to be the proper way to behave when Jacobs was giving him this sad story about Quinn's giving his life for his country. And he had Eve's statement to compare with Jacob's story. Catherine nodded. Anyway, the sheriff refused to turn over anything to Jacobs since he was implicated in the story that Eve told him. He told Jacobs to have his superior contact him and he'd cooperate. So Jacobs didn't get the ledger, and everything must have seemed to be going downhill for him. His partner was dead, and he was probably going to be revealed as a crook, and his army career would go down the drain. She picked up her knapsack. Which means we'd better get on the move. Jacobs has had too long to tie up loose ends and destroy any other evidence against him. We'll be lucky if we're able to locate him. We'll locate him. Gallo was already moving down the trail. Call your chief Venable as soon as we get to the car and see if he can trace him. Gallo's tone was as grim as his face. He was in battle mode. Well, so was she, Catherine thought. It was strange that after being enemies these last weeks, they were walking this path together. Strange, and somehow right. An hour later, she hung up from the callback she'd received from Venable and turned to Gallo, who was in the driver's seat. Jacobs took a leave of absence from the office the day after he returned from Milwaukee. His superiors have been trying to get in touch with him since all hell broke loose about Quinn's death. The questions began to fly about Quinn's and Jacobs' possible criminal involvement. No luck. Jacobs is not answering his phone, and he's just recently moved out of his apartment. She shook her head. We may be too late. He could have panicked and decided to go on the run. He's probably flown off to some place in the South Seas from which he can't be extradited. Possibly, Gallo was thinking. But Jacobs wasn't the type to turn into a beachcomber. It would be too savage for his tastes. He was very urban-oriented. How do you know? I thought you said he was the invisible man. That doesn't mean I didn't make the effort to see him for what he was. He worked closely with Quinn. There was always a chance that I'd find a use for him. If he did go on the run, it shouldn't be too hard to track him. You don't think he'd go undercover? Gallo shook his head. Maybe, but if he did, then I know what to look for. What? A casino. Jacobs is a gambler, an addict. That's one of the reasons that he never left Quinn no matter how hot the situation got. He was nervous all the time, but he couldn't let go. He needed the money and he lost more than he won at the tables. There are a lot of casinos in the world. Then we'll narrow them down. How? He shrugged. First, we'll go to Jacob's apartment and see if we can find a clue as to where we'd have our best shot. Did you get his address? She nodded at the number she typed into her phone. His apartment is in Georgetown. Then call and see what's the quickest flight we can get to Washington out of either Milwaukee or Chicago. She hesitated. Orders, Gallo? I believe in balance. You were giving me enough orders before we got on the road. And now he was moving, thinking, functioning with lightning efficiency. Why was she complaining? She should be glad she was going to have a fight for dominance. It would make the possibility of finding Jacobs all the more likely. Have you forgotten that the police are looking for you? We'd do better to hire a private plane. I have a contact with. No time. I have several sets of false IDs that Quinn and Jacobs supplied me, and a couple I purchased from private sources. I could never be sure when Quinn or Jacobs would decide to send one of their hired killers after me, and I might have to go undercover for a while. Like Jacobs. Exactly like Jacobs. You're not afraid that security will recognize you. I'll send you through in front of me. No one is going to look at me when you're around. Like Jacobs, I'll be the invisible man. Yeah, sure. But if you're willing to take the risk, it's okay with me. She took out her phone. I'll bet we'll find our flight out of Chicago. The traffic is much heavier. Catherine received a call from Eve 2 hours later, when they were heading for Gate 23 at Chicago's O'Hare Airport. Damn it, she didn't want to face Eve now. Should she ignore it? Of course not. Eve would not forgive her. Deal with it. Where are you, Eve? She said when she picked up the phone. And is Joe with you? I'm on my way to Gallo's place in the hills. I wanted to see you. She paused. And by the noise I'm hearing in the background, you're not there. An airport? Yes, I knew I blew it when I was talking to you before. I had to get out of there before you descended on us. Joe? He's not with me. I needed a little time to persuade you to forget this idiocy. Jane is trying to give me a day before she tells him. She won't be able to do it. You know it as well as I do. Joe is too sharp. Eve ignored her words. Us. You said us. You're with Gallo. You knew I was, or you wouldn't have come running to save me, she said quietly. I don't need saving, Eve. He's not going to hurt me. She paused. And he didn't kill Bonnie. For God's sake, he has you believe in him. Catherine could hear the despair in her voice. He did it, Catherine. I know how convincing he can be. But you have to think. No, you have to think, Catherine said. You and Gallo are both so twisted and turned around about how you feel about Bonnie that you're willing to jump at any explanation that sounds halfway reasonable. Only this isn't reasonable. Just because Black believed what he was saying is no sign it was the truth. You're the one who's jumping at explanations. What did he do to persuade you? Nothing, except try to get himself killed. figured that was unusual behavior and deserving of a little thought. What? Never mind. There's no way that I have time or enough valid arguments to make you listen. All I can say is that I know you're on the wrong track. I feel it. You're a great one for believing in instinct. You believe in Gallo, and I thought you were a gullible fool for doing it. Now the situation is reversed. All I can ask is that you trust me. Eve was silent. I do trust you, but I think you're... Where are you going, Catherine? When you can tell me honestly that you'll help instead of try to stop me, I'll talk to you. She drew a deep breath. Please, I don't want to do this without you, Eve. I fought my way through this. I'm doing the right thing. Then tell me where you're going. Start where I did and work it out for yourself. Start where I did and work it out for yourself. Goodbye, Eve. She hung up. Gallo was gazing at her expression. That was painful for you. Of course it was. She's my friend. Her throat was tight. All I ever wanted to do was help her. And now she thinks I've betrayed her. And that I lured you from the straight path. They had reached the gate, and he turned to face her. Eve should know better than to think I'd have that kind of power over you. She's usually more clear-headed. But he did have an alluring charisma, and she had been struggling against it for weeks. She only hoped she'd been telling Eve the truth when she told her Gallo hadn't unduly influenced her. Hope? Damn it, of course she'd been honest with Eve. She had to trust in herself as she always had. Otherwise she had nothing. You're Bonnie's father. Evidently you were Eve's Achilles' heel when she was a kid of 16. It's probably easy for her to imagine that you might be able to sway me to your way of thinking. Achilles' heel? That could have all kinds of meanings. He looked away from her and said haltingly, If it makes any sense to you, if it makes any difference to you, it means a good deal to me that you believe so deeply that you're doing the right thing. In a way, that means you believe me. You act as if that's completely unheard of for anyone to have any trust in you. Not completely, but I can remember only a couple of people who trusted me to that extent. Maybe my commanding officer, Ron Capshaw, who was in charge of our mission to Korea. I was just a green kid, fresh out of ranger school, but he took me under his wing and told everyone he knew I could do the job. I liked him. He made me feel as if I could do anything, if I tried hard enough. His lips tightened. But we had to split up, and he and Lieutenant Silac were killed when I was taken prisoner. He shrugged. Other than Ron, I guess the only other person who trusted me to do the right thing was my Uncle Ted when I was a kid. He was the only one who gave a damn about me when I was growing up. He grimaced. Not that I deserved it even then. I was a real hell-raiser. But sometimes you get more than you're entitled to get. He turned toward the gate again. He turned toward the gate agent, who was starting to call the flight. Like now. Like Catherine Ling fighting the friend she loves to save my ass. He took her elbow. That's our section being called. Come on, let's get this show on the road. Gallo, I'm not doing this for any... I know, I'm not assuming anything that you wouldn't want me to assume. Don't worry, I'm not suffering a major character change. The soberness was suddenly gone, and he was smiling recklessly. You'll still have to watch me and make sure I don't try to manipulate you to get what I want. I'm still the same hell-raiser I was when I was a kid. I just raise it in different ways.